Hi everyone, this is I'm Stuck and welcome back to our history series on America 1920 to 1973. Today we're exploring one of the social changes of the Roaring Twenties, and this is the transformation of women's roles and the emergence of the flapper. The 1920s saw a revolution in how women dressed, behaved and thought about their place in society. For the first time in American history, large numbers of women were challenging traditional expectations of how they should look and act. By the end of the video, you'll understand exactly how World War I changed the women's position in society, why women gained the right to vote in 1920, what flappers represented and why they were so controversial, and how women's fashion and behaviour changed dramatically. To understand the changes of the 1920s, we need to start with the World War I, which fundamentally altered women's roles in American society. Before the war, most middle and upper class women were expected to stay at home, and if they did work, it was only very limited roles like teaching or nursing. When America entered the war in 1917, millions of men left to fight in Europe. This created a massive labour shortage that could only be filled by women. For the first time, women took on jobs that had been exclusively male, working in munition factories, driving trucks, operating machinery, and even working in shipyards and steel mills. This wasn't just about taking any job. These are well-paid, skilled positions that gave women economic independence they'd never experienced before. Women discovered that they could do men's work just as effectively, and many enjoyed the financial freedom and sense of purpose that paid employment provided. Women's contribution to the war effort also strengthened arguments for women's suffrage. How could women be denied the right to vote when they were working in factories, buying war bonds, and supporting the war effort? The war proved that women were full citizens who deserved full political rights. Therefore, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. This was a massive milestone that represented the culmination of decades of campaigning by suffragettes. Suddenly, women weren't just workers, they were political participants with the power to influence elections and government policy. However, many women found that when the war ended, they were expected to give up their jobs and return to their traditional domestic roles. This created tension between the independence that women had tasted and the traditional expectations society still held for them. This tension then created the emergence of the flapper. So the flapper was a young woman who rejected the traditional female behaviour and embraced a lifestyle of freedom, fun and rebellion. Flappers were easily recognised by their appearance, which was considered controversial in comparison to traditional values. They cut their hair short into bobs when long hair had been considered essential to femininity. They wore shorter clothing, such as short skirts, which showed more skin. And this was considered shocking in an era where women's legs had been completely hidden. And they abandoned tight corsets in favour of loose, straight dresses, which allowed them for easy movement. However, flappers weren't just about fashion. They also adopted behaviours which were considered unfeminine, such as smoking cigarettes in public, something which had been considered scandalous. And they also drank openly despite prohibition. They also went into jazz clubs and danced to new music as well. So the flappers also embraced new technologies which gave them independence. Many learned to drive cars which allowed them to go out without chaperones. And they used makeup openly, wore jewellery, and spent money on fashion and entertainment, rather than saving it for marriage and family. And perhaps most shockingly, flappers changed the rule of dating and relationships. They went out alone, without chaperones, engaged in casual dating rather than formal courtship, and some even lived independently in apartments, rather than with their families until marriage. The flapper represented a complete rejection of the Victorian ideal of womanhood. Flappers were actually controversially bold and independent. Let's look at the fashion revolution. So women wore floor-length dresses before the 1920s, with high necklines and long sleeves, and their hair long and covered them from neck to ankle. The flapper look was completely different. Flappers also revolutionized how makeup and accessories were used. They wore bright red lipstick, dark eye makeup, and rouge on their cheeks, all which had been previously associated with prostitutes. They wore long pearl necklaces, headbands with feathers or jewels, and carried small beaded purses. The fashion revolution created a booming industry. Cosmetic companies like Revlon and Max Factor were expanded rapidly. Fashion magazines like Vogue became more influential. Department stores created special sections for younger women's clothing, and the fashion industry recognized that women had disposable income and were willing to spend it on appearance. While flappers got the most attention, the 1920s also saw significant changes in women's work and economic independence. The war had shown that women could perform many jobs previously thought to be exclusively male, and some of these opportunities continued into the 1920s. By 1929, about 10 million women had jobs, roughly 20% of all women in the country. This was a significant increase from pre-war levels. Women worked as shop assistants, telephone operators, typists, and secretaries. Some also became teachers, nurses, or social workers, and few even entered previously male professions like law, medicine, and journalism. The rise of consumer culture also created many new job opportunities for women. Department stores needed saleswomen, offices needed secretaries and typists, and the growing service economy needed workers who could interact with customers. And many of these jobs were seen suitable for women because they require communication skills and attention to detail. For the first time, significant numbers of women could afford to live independently. In major cities, young women rented apartments together, went out to restaurants and clubs, and spent their wages on fashion and entertainment. This independence was revolutionary. Previously, women had moved from father's house to their husband's house, rarely experiencing a life on their own. This economic independence of the 1920s also affected marriage patterns. Women were marrying later, having fewer children, and some were choosing not to marry at all. The divorce rate during the decade also doubled, as women realized that they didn't have to stay in unhappy marriages if they could support themselves. However, it's also important to note that working women still faced significant discrimination. They were paid much less than men for the same work. They were also fired when they were married, and were also excluded from many professions. While the flapper movement was dramatic and attention-grabbing, it's crucial to understand the significant limitations of women's liberation in the 1920s. First, flappers were primarily young, white, urban, and middle-class women. The majority of American women, especially people in rural areas, working-class women, and women of colour, had neither the economic resources nor the social freedom to adopt these flapper lifestyles. African American women faced double the burden by having racial and gender discrimination at the same time. While some participated in the Harlem Renaissance and embraced aspects of flapper culture, they were also excluded from many of the opportunities that white women enjoyed. Similarly, immigrant women often had to balance the new American freedoms with traditional cultural expectations from their families. Working class women might have jobs, but they were typically low paid and exhausting. They couldn't afford the fashions, the entertainment, and the independence that characterized flapper culture. And many worked to support their families rather than for personal fulfillment. Even for flappers, the traditional expectations about marriage and motherhood remained strong. Most flappers eventually married and were expected to give up their jobs and independence to become wives and mothers. The idea that women could have both a career and a family was still decades away. Even with the right to vote, women's political participation remained limited. Many women didn't vote regularly, they rarely ran for office. The expectation that politics was a male sphere remained strong throughout the decade. The transformation of these women's roles in the 1920s was both revolutionary and limited. The flapper phenomenon represented a dramatic challenge to the traditional gender roles and showed that significant social change was possible. Women gained the right to vote, entered the workforce in large numbers, and claimed freedoms in fashion, behaviour, and lifestyle. However, these changes primarily benefited a small group of urban, middle-class white women, and the majority of American women continued to face significant restrictions and discrimination. The changes of the 1920s were more about expanding options for some women rather than achieving true equality for all women. That's it for this video. That's to kind of sum up of it all. In our next video, we'll be exploring prohibition and the issues of organised crime. Thanks for watching. If it did help, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.